In dramatic events unfolding right now in Venezuela, you're looking at live picture. Democracy activists there are clashing with government forces in the streets of Caracas. The White House calls it a turning point and potential defining moment in the unrest in that country. The Latin American country, of course, that has the world's largest oil reserves. Hi, everybody. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. You're watching a special edition of the Briefing Room with breaking news today. Mary Alice Parks, our deputy political director, is here. We have full team coverage right now of the unrest in Venezuela. Mary Alice, what's so striking about what we've been seeing all morning with these images is that the protests may be smaller in size, but they are more violent than we've ever seen before.
And this has been sort of a long time in the works. We've had unrest in this country for the last few months, but today feels different. We're seeing really violent protests and clashes for the first time in a long time. So it's hard to know where this goes from here. Yeah,
this is right in the heart of the capital of Venezuela in Caracas, just 10 blocks from the presidential palace. Of course, the United States supporting opposition leader Juan Guaido. A very significant moment, according to the White House. Our Tom Llamas, senior national correspondent, is here with us now from New York. Tom, you'd spent a lot of time on the ground there. You also interviewed and battled President Maduro recently. Help us understand the significance, big picture significance of what we're seeing today.
Right. So what was supposed to happen was tomorrow there was going to be a massive protest. But this morning, Juan Guaido, the interim president, with essentially a power play, he appeared before cameras, putting out a video and basically calling on a drastic change in Venezuela. And right behind him, the man with his arms to the side is Leopoldo Lopez, who really, before Guaido, was the face of the opposition movement, but he had been incarcerated and under house arrest. And this is the first time we've seen Lopez really out in the public and supporting the opposition once again in a very public way. Now, Guaido was also surrounded by members of the National Guard and by other military leaders, essentially signaling that this could be a break in the ranks, that his support was growing within Maduro's government. Now, there are so many members of that military, and from everything we've seen today, Maduro is still very much in control of that country. But we saw clashes, very, very violent clashes that we haven't seen in months. One instance in particular was when an armored vehicle was facing off against demonstrators who had rocks and sticks and Molotov cocktails. This is one of the moments right here. And they were trying to disperse the demonstrators. The demonstrators are throwing Molotov cocktails, trying to set these vehicles on fire. And at one point, a driver of one of these vehicles just hits the gas and advances and moves forward and ends up running over some of these demonstrators. We'll see that moment play out here in just a few seconds, and here it is. And people were run over there. Protesters were injured. And then after that, there was exchanges of gunfire. People were just, it seemed they were firing into the air, firing in the direction of whatever the opposition force was. And we've seen Juan Guaido take to the streets and walk through the streets with other members of the opposition party and also with just regular Venezuelans. And these are regular Venezuelans here that are protesting. We've also seen, guys, every major member of President Trump's administration, including the president himself, say today on Twitter that they're supporting Juan Guaido, they're supporting the opposition movement, and National Security Advisor John Bolton also with some strong words. The big question is, though, what happens now, though? That the military, will the U.S. military get involved? It's not likely that's going to happen. And if Maduro still has control of his military, it's unclear what Guaido can do, if anything.
Yeah, and Tom, why hasn't the military in Venezuela broken with Maduro and more actively joined the forces with Guaido? There
are different factions of the military. So you have your traditional army, and they are backing Maduro for several reasons. But one, they get a piece of the action, if you will. The military is involved in every business deal, in the selling of oil, in most transactions, like in many totalitarian countries. The military gets a piece of that action, so it is beneficial to them from a financial standpoint to stand with Maduro. And then there's what they call the colectivos, essentially like the citizen army of Maduro, regular people, low-income people that have been armed by the government to make sure they back up Maduro in situations like this. You have the National Guard as well, and then you also have militias that are the elderly. They're sort of the older statesmen of the Socialist Party. but still support Maduro as well. And they have uniforms. The colectivos don't have uniforms. They're essentially, civilians that are armed, that actually do a lot of the killings. When we talk about the 500 or so opposition members that have been killed since Maduro's taken power, a lot of those killings and kidnappings are done by members of the colectivo. And that's the main reason why the military doesn't stop supporting Maduro. They have a financial stake in this. They have a financial stake in Venezuela as a country, and they have to stick with Maduro for that to happen.
But Tom, remind us how we got here, because for Americans that aren't paying attention to every twist and turn, it's been weeks since that election, weeks since a large part of the international community said that Guaido should be honored as the actual president. So what has he been doing in the intermediate time since today, and how did it escalate here?
So we could just back up, a few years. Hugo Chavez is the leader of Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro is his number 2. Chavez dies. Maduro becomes the president, the leader of Venezuela. And then Maduro has a recent election. But the problem is that he's taken over complete power of the country. So the election, opposition leaders can't run against him. It's an election that's seen that most people don't turn out for. And so the National Assembly, which was essentially the Congress of Venezuela, deems that election was fraudulent, and they're not going to accept the results. Juan Guaido, who's part of the National Assembly, assumes power. He says, because of a clause in the Constitution, this election wasn't valid, and I am now the president of Venezuela. This took Maduro by surprise. Maduro saying that's not the case. I have the military. I'm still in power. I was elected. The U.S. and more than 50 other countries backing Guaido and saying, you are the true leader of Venezuela. But without the military, he doesn't have any real power. And Maduro has gone around and created his own Congress that is loyal to him. So if we sort of pretend like this is America, imagine if the president had the Supreme Court and then created an entire Congress that is just loyal to him, and that's what Maduro has done as well. So the question is, what does he do with Guaido? Does he arrest him? Does some faction in Venezuela try to kill Guaido? These are all things that we're going to have to watch right now, because that could be a turning point for the United States. But as you guys know from being White House watchers, our president is not a president that is looking to go to war. If anything, he's called for a drawback of troops in many situations. So, and we don't have military positions right now on the border around Venezuela, which is interesting because people in Venezuela think U.S. troops are right at the border ready to invade and to support Guaido, when in reality we know that's not the case.
I want to bring in Danny Bahar to this conversation. He's a Venezuelan economist at Brookings Institution. Danny, pick up where Tom left off there. What are the American interests at stake here? What should Americans know about Venezuela, and what's on the line with this unrest?
Well, the very big topic that I think all Americans should think when thinking about Venezuela is democracy. Venezuela and the U.S. were countries that were very close. They had very strong economic ties. Until recently, actually, U.S. Was the main consumer for Venezuelan oil. But the situation there has deteriorated quite a bit, especially in the past 2 or 3 years. It's not a free, there's no freedom, it's a dictatorship, there are no free or fair elections. There are political prisoners, and the U.S., as being the leader of the free world, they should take a stand on these issues. I think Venezuela is in fact not a right or left wing. If anything, Venezuela is an issue that should unify Americans as of now.
And is there a strong and politically active political diaspora here in the United States? What about Venezuelan Americans or immigrants that are here in the United States? Is there a relationship back and forth that's playing out right now?
Yeah, definitely. The U.S. is hosting, the number is not completely unknown, but it's hosting a few good 100,000 of Venezuelans who live here. Many of them, most of them probably arrived in the past 10 years. But there's not only a diaspora, there's also political figures that are on exile here that have found refuge here in the U.S. But moreover, there's also an ambassador and their diplomatic corps that have been recognized by President Trump and the White House on behalf of the interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. So there is actually a direct representation of the government or the interim government of Venezuela that is actually very active here in Washington, D.C.
All right, Danny Bahar at the Brookings Institution. Thanks so much, Danny. Let's go over to the State Department now. Connor Finnegan has been reporting out on the U.S. government stance towards all this. Connor, we heard from top officials, American officials, a little while ago. They are not calling this a coup. What are they calling this? And what is the posture of the U.S. military right now?
Devin, they're calling this an uprising because it's one that is popularly supported by the people of Venezuela. As we've talked about so far, Juan Guaido, they say, is the legitimate leader in Venezuela, no longer Nicolas Maduro. And so this is part of the constitutional process that Tom was talking about earlier, and simply a way for Juan Guaido to continue to exert that and eventually take power. We've heard from the Pentagon so far that they are closely monitoring the situation in Venezuela. They're working with their interagency partners here at the State Department, at the National Security Council, at the White House, but their posture so far remains unchanged. As Tom also said, there's no U.S. troops on the border or in the region, really. The military's role so far has been limited to humanitarian assistance. They've helped to fly down tons of humanitarian aid to Cucuta, Colombia, across the border, to Brazil, and to some of the Caribbean islands, to pre-position it in the event that Maduro does fall and Juan Guaido comes to power, and they can begin to finally bring that aid into the country, which has been suffering for so long under Maduro's economic mismanagement. One important thing I do want to bring you guys now, we just had a briefing with Special Envoy Elliot Abrams. And he gave us a little bit more insight into what the U.S. knew about today's events. He said that there was no advance warning for America, but that they thought this chain of events was going to happen tomorrow when there were plans for major protests across the country then. He also outed 3 senior Maduro officials, the defense minister, the head of the National Guard, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He said that those 3 officials were in touch with Juan Guaido's government to recognize him at some point in time. John Bolton, over the last couple hours, has been laying down a timeline for them to issue their support for Juan Guaido, which they have not done so far. In fact, the defense minister reiterated his support for Nicolas Maduro. And now Special Envoy Abrams says that those leaders must recognize Juan Guaido and begin the transition to democracy, or they lose their opportunity to no longer be in power, no longer be part of the power-sharing government, perhaps, that would come after Maduro's fall.
Yeah, Connor Finnegan at the State Department, thanks so much. You talked about the National Security Advisor. He's been briefing President Trump at the White House. He just emerged from the West Wing a short time ago to talk to reporters. He says the president is following this minute by minute. Those were his words. Here's a little more of what John Bolton had to say.
Let me say 2 things to be very clear. Number 1, we want as our principal objective the peaceful transfer of power. But I will say again, as the president has said from the outset, and that Nicolas Maduro and those supporting him, particularly those who are not Venezuelan, should know is all options are on the table.
Let's go to the White House now. We have our reporter, Jordan Phelps. We're hearing a little bit about the reaction from President Trump so far, but Jordan, what else can you tell us about the White House is saying right now?
Yeah, Mary Alice, the president hasn't said a whole lot on this. He only sent out his first tweet on it this afternoon, expressing the United States' support for the people of Venezuela. He says, I'm monitoring this situation very closely. The United States stands with the people in Venezuela and their freedom. But we did hear quite a bit more from National Security Advisor John Bolton. We learned last minute that he was going to come out and provide an update. And you heard him there. Basically, the administration, while they are not offering any sort of military support at this point and only saying that those options remain on the table, the administration is making no secret about where the United States stands on this, very much supportive of the opposition efforts there. Bolton really describing the situation on the ground right now as a potential watershed moment. He says the situation is very delicate, but the administration obviously very supportive of Guaido and the opposition there. And he said that the administration has been preparing for a very long time for the day after Maduro, and suggested that they might speed things up with a briefing later this week on that topic. So the administration very much wanting to see this transition away from Maduro in Guaido's favor.
All right, Jordan, thank you so much for that. Stand by. I want to just go back to Tom Yamas to button this all up for us. Tom, how will we know if this moment is different? What should people look for to find out if, in fact, as John Bolton says, this is the watershed moment after months of this?
No, it's a good question, because we were just here, a couple of months ago when all that aid was sitting at the border in Colombia and Brazil, all the aid from the United States, and Maduro said he wasn't going to allow it in, and those massive clashes happened at the border, and Maduro was still able to hold power after that. So we have been at this point before. The one thing I will say, and this could change at any moment, but, Venezuela is a totalitarian regime right now. The Maduro regime is totalitarianism, and they're always on TV. And for some reason, Maduro has not come out on television to address everything that's happened so far. He's put out some tweets earlier in the day saying that the military has nerves of steel and that he's spoken to all the military leaders around the country. But he personally, we haven't seen him just yet. And so I think once we do see him, we will know whether he is empowered, he's going to stay there. And if we don't see him, it's a sign that he could be a little nervous.
Yeah, or if there's some development that, like you said, all of a sudden spurs the United States to take different action.
Yeah, and we haven't heard from President Trump on camera on this yet either, so we'll stay tuned on that front. Tom Yamas, thank you so much, and Jordan Phelps at the White House will stick with us. Shifting gears a little bit now, while the president is watching this minute by minute from the White House, he also had a rare meeting today with the top two Democratic leaders in Congress to talk, wait for it, infrastructure. We've been here before, haven't we?
This is only a DC
like deja vu.
This is only a DC joke.
In DC, the joke, inside joke, is that it's always infrastructure week here because both parties like to talk about it. They say they can agree on it, and yet we remain stuck in neutral on this one.
And
no
when you
pun
ask
intended.
members of Congress, what's something you can work with the other party on?
Yeah.
They wait, they pause, and they say infrastructure.
And they emerged today quite optimistic, quite rosy. This is some of the top lines out of the meeting today after Speaker Pelosi called it a great meeting. She said infrastructure is a great thing, as if anybody doubted it, that they agreed to pursue a big and bold plan, that they are going to spend $2 trillion. The president apparently likes the number 2 on this one, and that they'll meet in 3 weeks to talk again because, of course, Mary Alice, the big question in all of this is, who's going to foot the bill?
Oh, I like that graphic. Look at those zeros. And obviously, Republicans generally are against increased government funding, government spending, especially with numbers like that. So as anything here in town, the devil is in the details. And it is a long way out before we have any agreement about how in the world they would pay for something like that.
And we both have cars. You probably have a car, too. There's really no doubt that the roads in this country, among other things, need to be repaired. They need an infusion of cash at the state level and at the federal level. Let's go back to the White House. Jordan Phelps. Jordan, you were closely following this meeting. It didn't seem to be as theatrical as some of these previous encounters between Democrats and the president. What's the bottom line out there?
Yeah, no, Devin, you will recall that last time these leaders got together with the president, January 9th, that's how long ago it was. That meeting ended in fireworks after only 14 minutes after the president started out the meeting by handing out candy. He ended it by walking out of the room. This one ended quite differently. They spent an hour and a half together. The president, I guess, offered Nancy Pelosi a Tic Tac midway through the meeting, but they came out with a rosy assessment. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer saying the meeting was very constructive. And the big takeaway there is that they agreed to this big number, $2 trillion in funding. That's significant because the White House just yesterday told me that we shouldn't expect to see any numbers come out of this meeting today, but the president went there. The president, in breaking with his party, very much does not trust in this public-private partnership idea, this idea that the government should just throw a little money at this and try to spur more private investment. The president thinks that doesn't work. He wants to see the government directly put this funding into this bill. So he really comes away from a meeting like this, maybe more in agreement with the Democrats than many in his own party. But interestingly, while this meeting was taking place, the president's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, was clear across the country in California, speaking at a conference where he was very openly skeptical about the chances for any infrastructure deal to actually come out of this, because he said even if they were to agree to something today, there wouldn't be the end result, the actual roads being laid down for probably 10 years. And he said that's unacceptable because they won't get to see it under the president's watch. So the administration is saying that they very much need to speed up the timeline for the approval process in order for the White House to get behind something.
You know, Jordan, not only are there a lot of questions as to how they would pay for such a large package, but also how they would agree on what to spend that $2 trillion on. You know, we can think about roads and bridges, airports, some basics of infrastructure,
right.
But Democrats are talking about clean energy, renewable energy, flood walls, preventing the impacts of climate change. Was there any conversation, any sense from the White House on where they might agree on spending some of this money, or what would come first in their priority list?
One of the big agreements, according to Nancy Pelosi, was that they agreed on expanding access to broadband internet. Nancy Pelosi pointed to that as a big victory. But Mary Alice, you're right that what this money gets spent on, there are very different priorities. We've seen this president like to invest in energy infrastructure. And as you might understand, that means a very different thing to Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, of course, would like to see, more invested for pipelines and energy exploration, whereas Democrats obviously have a lot more concerns about environmental protections. And those environmental protections, Mary Alice, are, of course, as you know, one of the reasons that it takes a while for infrastructure projects to get approved because of all this red tape that you have to go through to get approvals to make sure you're not harming the environment. The White House wants to see that process sped up.
And the differences might even be more fundamental. Before they even get to figuring out how to spend the money, they have to figure out how to raise the money. And that is going to be a huge sticking point. It has been for years within the Republican Party, between Republicans and Democrats. A lot of Democrats talking about wanting to roll back the Trump tax cuts to pay for it. We also see a lot of talk about increasing the gas tax. Let's put up some data points on that for you to take a look at here. Right now, by the way, most people are paying about $2.80 a gallon. 18 cents of that is federal gas tax, and that has held steady since 1993. They've never increased it. So there's a lot of talk in this country about increasing that for the first time in 20 plus years there. Just for a reference point, 25-cent increase would raise about $290 billion over a decade. Most experts say that would be a drop in the bucket. We have $420 billion of projects just to repair right now, but that's one approach. Interesting, though, because Democrats say the gas tax would be put on the backs of most average, everyday Americans.
Well, yeah, that's a highly controversial idea. A lot of Republicans in general don't like the idea of raising taxes at all. But in this case, you have a lot of Democrats, too, that argue against a tax like this because it hits everyone evenly. It doesn't matter if you're at the low end of the income spectrum or the high end. You drive a car to get to work for most Americans. And so, I think that that's a long way out, the possibility of another federal gas tax.
And before we go, we'd be remiss if we didn't also address the elephant in the room on this big bipartisan moment. There is, of course, the investigations that House Democrats are leading into President Trump. Our John Karl, chief White House correspondent, asked Speaker Pelosi about this today, whether she can actually broker a deal with the president on infrastructure while still at the same time going after him with investigations. Take a listen.
Right after the midterms, the president suggested that he wouldn't be able to work with you if you were simultaneously investigating him. Do you get the sense that that has passed? And can I ask you, what is a bigger priority for Democrats, investigating the president or trying to work with him?
Our priority is to honor our responsibilities under the Constitution of the United States, to meet the needs of the American people, and to honor our oath of office.
In previous meetings, the president has said, if these investigations continue, I can't work with you. He didn't bring it up. And so we're going, I believe, we can do both at once. We can come up with some good ideas on infrastructure, and we want to hear his ideas on funding. That's going to be the crucial point, in my opinion. And the House and the Senate can proceed in its oversight responsibilities. The two are not mutually exclusive, and we were glad he didn't make it that way.
Democrats there are trying to walk a tightrope. They would like to go into elections being able to say at least that in theory they can work with this president. Jordan, that same question to you there at the White House. From the president's perspective, you'd have to think it would be a political win to be able to say that he got something done working with Democrats?
Mary Alice, we know that this White House wants to get something done on infrastructure. They also want to get something done on drug pricing. So very much in this administration's interest to move forward on these things. But we'll see if that in fact holds. We've seen this president take to Twitter on numerous occasions to shout out against what he calls presidential harassment, these ongoing investigations. It is really fascinating that the president did not bring the investigations up in this meeting, according to Democrats. We'll see if they're able to keep this truce going forward.
All right, Jordan Phelps, our White House reporter. Thanks so much, Jordan. Appreciate you as always. Finally, today, something we haven't seen up on Capitol Hill, Mary Alice, in 36 years. We saw a hearing on the Equal Rights Amendment. This is an idea of amending the United States Constitution to explicitly defend and support, affirm equal rights for all women in this country on the basis of sex. It's something that took off in 1972, but sort of floundered. 35 states ended up ratifying the amendment, but it just fell short of the 38 that were needed. Today we saw a number of advocates call for another push on this, including some celebrities. I caught up with actor Patricia Arquette, who was quite impassioned about this today in that first hearing, and here's what she had to say about why she's advocating for this.
Patricia, thanks so much for doing this. So this is quite personal for you.
It is. I mean, I think it really should be personal for every woman, and really it should mean a lot to every man who loves women or cares about equality at all.
Why has it taken so long? You testified today the first time in 36 years they've had a hearing. Why do you think this has just taken so long to have this hearing today?
I really think we have deeply ingrained bias against women, and I think maybe it hasn't been women's instinct to ask for that. And on the outside, you think, when you look at America, that women have equal rights, but when you start really picking it apart and looking at all the ways that women are falling through the cracks, you start to realize maybe we're not actually equal. And then when you learn that we were intentionally left out of the Constitution, and people have been trying for decades to keep us from having explicit equal rights, it starts to all kind of make sense.
And what is it about this moment that makes it the moment to push on this again?
Well, I think part of it is that we have more women breadwinners than ever before, and women are still dealing with this huge, it doesn't matter if you go to college, what degree you end up getting, you're still going to get paid less.
What's your message to young people who are watching this and go, you know, I'm for that? What do they need to do?
You have to contact your reps and say, we want to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment for our state. And if it has been ratified in your state, contact your federal representatives and say, we want federal equal rights for women.
You know, one of the things I was struck by, Mary Alice, being there, how many of the freshman women elected in that wave from 2018 are sort of energizing this push on the Equal Rights Amendment and so many other things that we see in this new Congress. It's really coming from the ground up and a clear byproduct of the midterms.
Yeah, well, they said all along that you need women to focus on some issues that impact women. That's a key part of the argument for more representative democracy.
And we should say we did see some men in the room there earlier today. It wasn't just all women, a number of members of Congress, including a couple of Republicans of note. So there we go. We'll see where that goes from here. It was just a hearing today. They have yet to take a vote. But great to have Mary Alice Parks, our Deputy Political Director, with us. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Thank you for watching. We're here every day, 3:30 Eastern Time in the briefing room with the latest political headlines from Washington and around the world. Download the app for the latest on all the stories we hit today. Hope to see you back here tomorrow.